President Trump is threatening to launch a new attack on Iran as Tehran's top diplomat warns they're prepared to immediately retaliate.
Big force going toward Iran. I'd rather not see anything happen, but we're watching them very closely. We have an armada. We have a massive fleet heading in that direction.
Thanks very much, comrades, for accepting the invitation.
With to getting them to crack down, which the crackdown could then be used as a casus belli, certainly because of reindustrialization. What's needed is a really radical crash and devalorization of United States financial capitals and United States real estate. Because if the United States knocks out into full subordination all potential rivals, not just China,
Thanks very much, comrades, for accepting the invitation from Jonbesh TV. I'm going to ask their questions in English, and then they will do the translations. Feel free to correct the questions or add your own comments. So we want to start by Iran's internal unrest and its relation to great power rivalry. The protests of day 1404, which is December 2025, January 2026, were violently repressed at a time where there are explicit statements by the United States and Israeli officials who claim the presence of their field forces alongside protesters and promised external assistance, claiming that the Islamic Republic, these claims were then used by the Islamic Republic to frame the protests as an extension of the 12-day war, a reference to June Israeli war against Iran, followed by US. Should this simultaneity be understood merely as an opportunistic scrutinizing propaganda by the Iranian state, or does it point to a deeper structural entanglement between Iran's internal protest movement and inter-imperialist rivalries? More broadly, should escalating US pressure on Iran be analyzed within the context of US-China hegemonic competition, particularly given Iran's growing role in the Eurasian trade energy flows and the emerging corridor wars?
Okay, start with the first question, entanglement between the internal protest movement and the imperialist pressure. I cannot do anything other than I'm not in any sense privy to what the motivations of the Israeli government and Donald Trump are for asserting the heavy involvement of Mossad in the protests. The only thing I can think of is that it was intended as a provocation to the Iranian government with a view to getting them to crack down, which the crackdown could then be used as a casus belli, certainly because Trump was talking about the crackdown as a potential casus belli between the United States and Iran. But at the same time, exactly what they're doing, I have to say, is extraordinarily unclear. Secondly, the interconnection, I've said, and we in Weekly Worker have said repeatedly, sanctions are a form of warfare. And sanctions are a form of siege warfare which are directed against the general population of the state in question, however much they may say they're, quote, targeted, unquote. They're designed to degrade the economy of the targeted state. They're doing the same thing that the Royal Navy did when it blockaded Germany in order to starve the Germans in 1914 to 1918 and 1939 to 45. And the same thing which has been done in siege warfare on and off ever since the period of classical antiquity, when cities might be held under siege for more than a year in order to starve them out. And then the natural and probable consequence of this is that you're going to get protest movements unless the state does, as in fact Germany did until 1916, and Britain did from around 1916, and Britain did throughout 1939-45, when Germany was attempting to starve Britain out through submarine warfare, which is to impose full rationing and extensive directive economic controls, which in fact was, any city which was under siege did the same thing, again in classical antiquity through the Middle Ages into the early modern period. It's the pretense that sanctions are not warfare. And equally, the pretense that the targeted state doesn't need what the Neurath called Kriegssozialismus, war socialism, in order to defend itself under conditions of siege warfare, which is at issue. And that pretense, that set of pretenses, has the consequence that you're naturally going to get large-scale protests, and then the large-scale protests can be exploited as a lever for regime change. I do make the point. I sort of reiterate the point, because it is really worth saying that full Kriegssozialismus, war communism, can avoid this phenomenon of protests as sort of ground for undermining the regime. And of course, that then the consequence is, if we ask the question, why doesn't the Iranian regime introduce such economic measures, the answer is because it's ideologically committed. It's deeply ideologically committed to free market solutions, which of course has a certain basis in the there's a sort of I've read a really interesting book about Khomeini's legal conceptions some years ago, which is that Khomeini's legal conceptions are actually a Shiite variant of the Hanbali doctrine of the Saudis. That it's a diversion from prior Shiism, and the Hanbali doctrine of the Saudis, again, is deeply committed to free market solutions, precisely because at the end of the day, the Saudi regime is a creature of British imperialism in origins and of US imperialism more recently. Okay, second thing, is this, what's this got to do with the US-China? This, I think, has 3 or even perhaps 4 levels. And it's going to overlap with question 2, which is this structural crisis in the West? The first point, and I think probably the most fundamental, is that it remains the case that war fighting is powered by oil. We don't have electric tanks, electric fighter aircraft, electric strategic bombers. And although we have some nuclear-powered ships, it's actually, there are an awful lot of smaller ships which are not nuclear-powered. And in this context, the United States seeks and has always aimed for a monopoly veto control of oil resources. And that aim for monopoly veto control of oil resources, the United States in 1939-41 imposed oil sanctions on Japan in connection with the Japanese war in China, which precipitated Japanese the Japanese being forced to make a preemptive attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. So then the question is this: at whom is this oil veto control of oil aimed? It's not only aimed at China. It's also aimed at holding Japan, as in 1937-41, and France and Germany in subordination to the United States. It's about the United States' global control rather than specific rivalries, just specifically about rivalries with China. Second point connected with this, the Ukraine war points to the supersession of these military forms. The airplanes have not been able to give close air support because they can be taken out by surface-to-air missiles. The tanks have failed to break the front lines. Not only the Russian tanks, but also the Western tanks have failed to break the front lines because shoulder-launched missiles and drones have effectively taken them out. The result has been a static form of warfare like 1914-18, which depends on drones and on infantry and trenches and stuff being moved by human back and by a motorcycle and by and stuff like that. Equally the other side of the bit which we don't get so prominently reported about the Ukraine war is that the use of naval drones has effectively destroyed the Russian Black Sea Fleet, or at least made the Russian Black Sea Fleet unable to operate outside of cover in the very eastern part of the Black Sea. Drones then proved to be able to take out capital ships. So in a full-scale great power war, it's likely that the United States' carrier groups would be as vulnerable to this sort of operation as the Russian capital ships have proved to be in the Black Sea. So that in this sense, the United States faces the situation which Britain faced with the supersession of coal-powered operations with oil-powered operations. Okay, it took sort of longer for this to appear, but you get the 1914 and in 1918, the new model using tanks, using aircraft as close air support to attack the other side, the beginnings of aircraft carriers, and so on and so forth. That model emerges in 1918, is developed in the interwar period, and is the way in which the war is fought in 1939-45. So we haven't got a new solution. And the United States, in that sense, needs to knock out all potential rivals before the new solution is developed. Because if the United States knocks out into full subordination all potential rivals, not just China, but also the European powers and India, before a new military solution is developed, then the United States can maintain world dominance for another period of time. How long, I don't know. And that, in a sense, pushes towards the United States needs to pursue a more aggressive military policy and to push towards war. Third point, the militarization of United States operations is a military Keynesian stimulus to the US economy, and also operates at the expense of the European and Japanese economies. Less so at the expense of the Chinese economy, because the Chinese economy has a greater degree of autonomy relative to the United States. But as far as the United States relations with its quote allies unquote is concerned, the upping of US military operations is both undermines its allies' economies and strengthens the US economy, and we can see that in patterns. Fourth point, in spite of this, domestic policy in the United States cannot deliver what the MAGA voters want, Make America Great Again voters want. It can't deliver US reindustrialization, because in order to deliver US reindustrialization, what's needed is a really radical crash and devalorization of United States financial capitals and United States real estate. Because of the high levels of because US world dominance leads to money being sucked into the United States in search of safe harbors, the consequence is that drives up US real estate values and US financial capital operations. And by driving those up, it unavoidably increases wages, because you can't make workers work if they can't eat. And you can't make workers work if they can't eat, if they can't pay rent or mortgage installments, as the case may be, on property to live in. And from that point of view, therefore, what we get in consequence is performative operations which are designed to display we're making America great again by kidnapping the president of Venezuela, thus showing that the United States can do in Venezuela what it did in many Latin American countries in the 1950s. Though how far the United States is actually doing that, have we sent the Marines in? No, we've sent small numbers of special forces in to take out an individual, not to create effective regime change. So we give the appearance of US dominance without the same sort of boots on the ground operations which were characterized by British imperialism, or for that matter, by US imperialism in the 1950s and 1960s. But it's also the case by driving instability elsewhere. We suck money capital into the United States because we're still actually in the business of staving off the crash which the world economy needs, and in reality the US economy needs a sort of 75% crash in property values, in capital values. That's it.
Thanks. I'm going to ask the second question with some changes, but I'm sure you. So this is mainly about US-China rivalry, militarism, and the crisis of capital. So many people describe the current US-China tensions through a Cold War-style geopolitical lens. Do you agree with this framing, or would you argue that these conflicts are better understood as expressions of a deeper structural crisis of capital accumulation in the West? To what extent can the intensification of US militarism in West Asia, especially toward Iran, be interpreted as a compensation as a strategy responding to the declining rate of profit, economic stagnation, and the exhaustion of productive accumulation in core capitalist economies? I would question the generalization of declining rate of profit, but I would want to hear what you have to say.
Okay, in a sense, this is a false choice. I agree with you that I think it's the idea of the falling rate of profit is the underlying driver of this is overgeneralized. I've argued in the my long series, quote, Imperialism and the State, which is available on the Weekly Worker website from some years ago, um, that in general what happens is that you get over accumulate that there isn't a general rate of profit. You know, there is an average rate of profit, which is an item of information, but the proposition in Marxist Capital, Volume 3, that rates of profit converge is just untrue. It would be hypothetically the case that rates of profit converge in the very long term, but that's like the statement that entropy tends to the maximum. And then if you assumed that entropy had attained the maximum, there's nothing interesting to say. Yeah. In the same way, if you assume that rates of profit were equalized, it destroys an awful lot of the utility of the economic analysis of any sort. You know. Okay, so my understanding, for what it's worth, is that the rate of profit that tends to become that capital moves from lead sector to lead sector. So the transatlantic slave trade was the lead sector in the 18th century, but capital moving into the lead sector becomes overpopulated and has to experience a decapitalization, which can only happen through a crash. But insofar as the lead sector is tied to a state, which was the case in relation to the transatlantic slave trade in connection with the British shipping industry and the British Navy, but equally of coal and steel in relation to the British Navy in the 19th century and railways and so on, or petrochemicals in the United States today. The state is driven to prevent deflation in the core sector. And the result is that capital is pushed out of the core sector into financial and real estate speculation. And the financial and real estate speculation powers a bubble, which then crashes in the form of a financial crash. Okay, that's a slightly different take on falling rate of profit and so on. I did say in response to the first question, I think that if we think of the world economy as one economy, then Keynesian stimulus achieves nothing because it just defers the crunch. But if we think of the world economy as a combination of multiple economies integrated in a world system, each of which is attached to a particular state, then Keynesian stimulus, military Keynesian stimulus for the United States can raise the rate of profit in the United States at the expense of France, at the expense of Germany, etc., insofar as all the states can't do the same thing. It's partly for that reason that the United States has to put large efforts into holding other states in subordination in order to preserve its ability to inflate its own economy. But the Cold War, the second issue, is the alternative to that the Cold War analogy? And the answer is no, it isn't the Cold War analogy, because the essence of the Cold War was that the relationship between the Soviet regime and the Western and Southern Communist parties meant that in 1948 and following, outright war with the Soviet Union was not a practical option for the United States because it risked losing large chunks of the world to communist parties taking power. Yeah. And then the consequence of that, because of the character, in spite of whatever one may think of the nature of the Soviet regime and the nature of the communist parties and so on and so forth, that relationship between the Soviet regimes, the communist parties, and the working class in the West and in the South, yeah, meant that in order to defeat Russia, the United States had to pursue a complex policy in which it not only fought wars at the periphery, as in Korea, Vietnam, etc., and imposed sanctions and blockade on the Soviet Union, but also made major concessions to the workers' movement in the frontline states in Japan and in Europe, Western Europe, and major concessions to the national capitalists, nationalist movements in Latin America, in South Asia, in Africa, and so on and so forth. That relationship was busted. The fact that the Chinese are trying to make links with the Western and Southern workers' movement doesn't give them anything remotely like the links which the old Soviet Union had with the international communist movement. And the United States does not see, and capital in general does not see any need to carry on the sort of maneuvers that were carried on in the Cold War period to maintain the alliance systems. And, it's in the process of withdrawing all of the concessions within the United States itself as well as elsewhere. That's it.
On the third question, I'm also going to give a bit of a slight variation of what was asked. I personally don't think Iran plays a pivotal role in the Belt and Road Initiative, in China's Belt and Road Initiative, but you might disagree and you might say what you think. But what has been asked is assuming Iran occupies a pivotal position linking China to Europe, Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf. And here we could talk about its geographic position, or we could talk about its political situation. Geographically, there is an importance in the position in where Iran is, but I would certainly disagree with the assumptions that Iran plays a pivotal role in the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I don't think any country does, but given that assumption, has this positioning transformed Iran from a regional problem into a central node of great power competition? From the standpoint of US's strategic planning, should the Iranian nuclear file be understood less as a discrete security issue and more as a diplomatic framework, making a broader objective, destabilizing a critical component of China's emerging energy and transit networks? In this configuration, does Iran function as an autonomous strategic actor or as a geopolitical hostage within larger imperial formations?
Okay. The short answer on autonomous strategic actor or geopolitical hostage is quite clearly geopolitical hostage. Yeah. And that's been the case really since around 1800, when Britain and Russia played the great game over who would make Iran into a client state. I agree with you, Yasamin. It's wrong to think of Iran as pivotal to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is a name for a set of diplomatic commercial relations between China and a series of other countries. And it's sort of it's selling itself Belt and Road as if it was the Silk Road, as if it was this is purely uh, this is purely trade. It's trying to say we're not imperialists. We're really engaged just in bilateral trade relations, which are egalitarian. Yeah. I have to say that the French government took the same approach as against the British of saying we're not engaged in unpleasant imperialism like the British until the moment at which in the later 19th century the French went in for well, in the early 19th century, the French began to do a proper imperialism in North Africa, but later 19th century, it kicked off on a much larger scale. Yeah. Um, but certainly Anglo-French competition over Latin America was characterized by the French saying we're have egalitarian relations with you, and the United States similarly. The Monroe Doctrine, which has been back in the news because of the quote Donroe Doctrine, was actually about the United States saying we will protect the Latin American republics against the restoration of the Spanish Empire or the imposition of a British Empire. Oh yeah, what did this turn out to be? Yeah. So that Belt and Road. I don't think the architect. It's a misconception of what the architecture is. It's a misconceiving ideology for actual architecture. Yeah. Second point, the general US policy is one of aggressive encirclement of China so that China will be forced to strike the first blow. And that policy it's a repetition and or closely analogous to the British policy of aggressive encirclement of Germany to force Germany to strike the first blow between roughly 1904 and 1914. Um, uh, the the British armed Japan in order to defeat Russia. The defeat of Russia then forced the Russians to make geostrategic concessions to the British, and those geostrategic concessions allowed the creation of the Triple Entente. Meanwhile, France had already started on, but Britain joined in with building up counterpowers in the Balkans to close off preclude the Berlin-Baghdad railway project and close off German relations, cut off German relations with Turkey, which would be an obstacle to Anglo-French imperialist interests, already actually Anglo-French imperialist interests in controlling Turkey as creditors, under which they controlled the financial system and tax system of the Ottoman Empire. So that the problem which underlies this is that war fighting in modern society depends on persuading the domestic population that what you're doing is just. Because look at the United States' failure in Vietnam. When the United States lost legitimacy in Vietnam, it lost the ability to keep its army functioning, to keep its recruitment system functioning. Again, similarly, Ukraine demonstrates as, in a sense, the Russian invasion of Georgia in connection with the Abkhazia issue in 2008 suggested that we were back in the 18th century and the dominance of small professional armies where you don't have a problem about the legitimacy of your operations. Mm-hmm. But in reality, Ukraine demonstrates that that's not the case. Even if you don't need the levée en masse and universal conscription, you do need the guys, so the Ukrainians who are manufacturing drones in their garages, who are so celebrated by the West. It reflects the fact that the Ukrainians need public support, and it's exactly the same issue in relation to US operations against China US operations against Iran, US support for Israeli operations against the Palestinians. All of these need political efforts to make it appear that the other side are the aggressor. And Iran's nuclear file, yeah, that's really what's going on with that. Because okay, Israel's got the bomb. Israel's had the bomb since the 1960s. India's got the bomb. Pakistan has got the bomb. What's the Tom Lehrer song? First we got the bomb and that was good because we love peace and motherhood. That's from the 1960s. Then Russia got the bomb because that's okay because the balance of power's maintained that way. But the enormous wow about the possibility that Iran might get the bomb is just, it's all entirely propaganda for the benefit of US diplomatic and military operations. That's it.
On the fourth question, it mainly refers to strategic strangulation of China energy, sanctions regarding energy. US strategic doctrine has long identified China's primary vulnerability as energy security. To what extent should the US military presence in the Persian Gulf and sustained economic strangulation of Iran be interpreted as attempts to control the global energy bar, enabling Washington to disrupt the material foundations of China's economy? And the same in continuation of this, can the sanctions regime against Iran be understood as a form of Schumpeterian creative destruction, one that dismantles national productive and infrastructural capacities, disproportionately harms subordinate classes, and facilitates the eventual re-entry of Western capital under more exploitative conditions? You've replied to some of these in terms of sanctions, but I'll let you talk about this in terms of China.
Okay. China's vulnerability in relation to energy. Yeah. I think this is a sort of half-truth. I referred to this at the beginning, that the immediate vulnerability is a question of military vulnerability. I add that simply because, although it's true that China is short of oil, China's got very considerable coal reserves and has been moving rapidly to develop renewables. Yeah. And the scale of China, I don't know what China has in the way of a nuclear industry, but the scale of China and its technical development and so on and so forth means that in terms of industry and the economy, it could do without very large scale oil imports. It would be difficult and uncomfortable and so on and so forth transition, but it's not. When I can't remember the guy's name, General Eric Kurilla says in CENTCOM, which covers Iran and the Middle East, we have our hands on the throat of the Chinese economy. What he actually means is we have our hands on the throat of the People's Liberation Army, rather than of the Chinese economy as such. Though I mean, it's certainly the case there would be, just shutting off oil production would have serious consequences for China, but China has been moving rapidly into minimizing those consequences. Secondly, Schumpeterian destruction, creative destruction. I think this is radically misconceived. Oh dear, sorry, I've got somebody at the door. I need to. Schumpeterian creative destruction. This is radically misconceived. Consider Lebanon from the 1970s, Angola from the 1970s, Mozambique from the 1970s, Afghanistan from the 1980s, former Yugoslavia from the 1990s, Iraq, the consequences both of the 1991 war and of 2003, Libya, Syria, ... The problem, in essence, I said, how shall I put this? Capitalism is in absolute decline, but that means something quite limited. It's the same as feudalism was in absolute decline from around 1200. The slave society of classical antiquity was in absolute decline from around about the time of Augustus, 27 BC to 14 CE. The capitalism is in absolute decline because this is a point which has been made by Moshe Makova, but also by, more speculatively, also by István Meszaros, that capitalism has gone global since 1991. There is much more limited space for expansion of at the expense of the peasantry and of non-capitalist production. And at the same time, the consequence is that at the core of capitalism, in a sense, capitalism is like a hollow tree, that it's decaying in the middle, but it's growing at the outside. At the core, the society is dominated by the efforts of the capitalists to manage those below. The capitalists constantly have to worry about the working class. The efforts to keep the working class in control. And in a sense, we can see this again. MAGA, both the Bidenism and before that Obama's politics of hope and MAGA, are all ways to try and scam the working class into continued voting for the capitalists. And the corollary of that, when we think about the British Empire, which really was a regime of Schumpeterian creative destruction, smashing the Indian textile industry and creating a new mechanized Indian textile industry, introducing railways up and down the British colonial territory and outside the British colonial territory. And the same is true of the French Empire and so on. The United States, the European empires of the 19th century were built on large-scale export of people. And they were built on large-scale export of people because capitalism could live with deep-going corruption and savage exploitation of the domestic working class. Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England is a symptomatic example. The consequence of which is that both there's high levels of insecurity, and the consequence is that both the members of the working class and also members of the middle class, my own ancestors, were imperialist carpetbaggers in various parts of the world in the later 19th century. Both the working class and the middle class are prepared to go overseas to be soldiers of the crown in the colonies, to be colonial administrators, to try and make a living of one sort and another in that way. The United States doesn't export people in the same way. Yes, it sends people, ugly American businessmen and CIA operatives and so on and so forth, but it hasn't the same scale of ability to put boots on the ground to impose order. And the consequence is, since the United States as world hegemon has entered into relative decline, not total decline, but relative decline, it has to manage. The form of managing that decline is not territorial empire like Britain and France, but inflicting destruction and achieving nothing in terms of creation. So not Schumpeterian creative destruction, but just destruction. And in that sense, the victory, if we imagine that the United States wins in Ukraine and regime change ensues in Russia, what you're going to get is a breakup of the Russian Federation into a series of statelets run by warlords of one sort and another, the sort we already have in Central Asia, without actual substantial industrial or economic progress, but with economic decline, reduction in total productive output. And then the next is China, broken up into, next comes China, first encircled and then driven to attempt something else. And if the Chinese government is not prepared to have the nerve to launch a generalized nuclear exchange against the United States, leading to human extinction, it will be broken up by the same methods into multiple different statelets. And in fact, of course, what the United States planners want for Iran is breaking up into a Baluchistan, a Kurdistan, an Arab bit in the southwest, an Azeri bit in the northeast, because just as Britain broke up Gran Colombia, Britain intervened to break up Gran Colombia in the early 19th century into Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, etc., etc. The imperialist powers prefer to have small states, fragmented, balkanized, as the expression goes, under their control. So yeah, the US is driven to impose disorder and not facilitate the eventual return of international capital, but merely to suck cash into the US markets and keep it afloat. Does that address? I think that addresses what was in the question.
I think that covers, yeah. There's a further question on multipolarity in the global power system, China and the question of class. In sections of the global left, China's rise and the emergence of a multipolar world order are often celebrated as inherently progressive and anti-imperialist. Does the replacement of dollar hegemony with the yuan or institutions like the World Bank being replaced by Chinese banking systems meaningfully transform the social relations of global capitalism? Or does such a shift merely reconfigure the management of exploitation without altering the underlying class character of this exploitation?
Okay, I think that the second is the short answer to that, but I should add, however, that I don't think that well, in the first place, multipolarity. Somebody else has put online. Multipolarity is just a short road to world war, and that's correct. Yeah, that capital needs nation states money, but it also needs world money, and world money is guaranteed by a world hegemon state. It needs a world hegemon state, and in consequence, a condition of multipolarity within capitalism can't be sustained for any great length of time. It will drive towards world war. And we can see it, in fact, in front of our eyes, that the decline of the United States drives towards world war. Second question is whether it's actually possible. My understanding of what it's worth is that China can be considered as analogous to the Kaiserreich of Germany in 1870 to 1914, and that there was never any realistic prospect of the Kaiserreich actually displacing Britain as the world hegemon. What in fact happened was that the Kaiserreich fought Britain and France, and that enabled the United States to emerge as the world hegemon. And it's like the Kaiserreich. in the first in fundamentally, because although it's got highly advanced industry, it's also got a large burden of a large agrarian sector. And in China, in addition to the burden of a large agrarian sector, there's also persisting elements of Stalinism, that is, of the um, state state order of bureaucratic control and of state industries which are kept going in order to keep people employed, but which are not economically efficient from the point of view of capitalism. So the idea that China has gone all the way to capitalism is in that sense illusory. It's gone a long way, but it's still at the end of the day partially a Soviet-style regime, and that's actually a drag on it as a potential capitalist competitor, in the same way as the Junkers and the peasantry were a drag on Germany as a potential capitalist competitor in 1870 through 1945. Europe has been the France and Germany, the core countries of Europe, were trying to pursue the US policy. The United States held itself behind the British Navy as a shield in the period 1870 through 1945, number 1940s. Yeah. And combined that with pursuing a hard money policy. And in consequence, the upshot of that was that the United States became, over the course, it joined the First World War late in 1917, it joined the Second World War late in 1941. The consequence of that is that the United States is able to become a major creditor nation, but also then to create the conditions in which it can become the world hegemon power. So Europe, in that sense, has been clinging to, can we keep our industry, thriving industry, but not have the inordinate expense of maintaining world-class armed forces? We cling behind, just as the US stayed behind the Royal Navy, Europeans cling behind the US Armed Forces, hang behind the US Armed Forces. But this fails. And it fails for three reasons. The first, because the European Union Constitution is like the US Constitution before 1861 or Germany before the unification of the 1860s. It provides veto powers to minorities, which can then be used, just as Britain used the US Constitution and the veto of the slaveholders who were tied to Britain to control the United States until Lincoln. And Britain used the conflicts between the German states, multiple German states, to control Germany until Bismarck. Secondly, Europe succumbed to the temptation of expanding east. Yugoslavia in the 1990s, down to Ukraine in adopting the Americans' operation in 2014, although it was actually against European interests. And the upshot of this has been increased dependency on the United States, so that the Europeans have very little ability to act independent of the United States. Thirdly, by clinging to hard money policy, the Europeans destroyed European political solidarity in the Eurozone crisis in 2008-20 down through 2015. So that the consequence is that I don't think that China is capable of being the replacement world hegemon power, because it's got too much drag from its Stalinist past and from its agricultural sector. And the European powers aren't capable of doing it, because in order to do it, they need both radical overthrow of the European Union Constitution and the creation of an arms industry on a much bigger scale than what they've got at the moment. So I don't. The point being, therefore, although I agree that China replacing the US as world hegemon would just be a new imperialism, I don't actually think there's any likelihood of China replacing the US as world hegemon. Um, uh, uh, Simply because he's not actually in a position to do so. That's it.
Thanks. Multipolarity and the question of class. I think I did ask that, sorry. Axis of resistance, sorry. Neoliberalism and Marxist strategy. The Iranian state presents itself as a pillar of what is called the axis of resistance to US imperialism, a claim that resonates with sections of the international left. Yet domestically, Iran has implemented harsh neoliberal policies, labor precarization, privatization, commodification of education and healthcare. How should Marxists theoretically account for this contradiction between an externally framed anti-imperialist posture and an internally anti-working class political economy in the light of escalating military threats? What constitutes a principal Marxist position towards a potential war between US and Iran, one that opposes imperialist aggression while maintaining a clear political break from the Iranian state itself? Before you answer, I would add that I have repeatedly questioned Iran's claims to anti-imperialism. And in fact, they don't say they are anti-imperialist, they say they are against Western arrogance, which is a different thing, which justifies their neoliberalism and all sorts of economic policies that they took from the World Bank, from the International Monetary Fund. But also, I would say that the existence of the axis of resistance was very much a pragmatic approach by Iran's Islamic Republic to remain a power, because these were, if you like, the positions of defense before the US attacked, or Israel attacked Iran. In other words, both Hezbollah and Iran's claim to support sections of the Palestinian movement, because they really haven't been a major backer of Hamas, for example, contrary to the publicity of the US and Israelis. It has always been more a protection scheme for Iran's Islamic Republic. And indeed, the fall of those countries, or the weakness of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the defeats in occupied Palestine, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, paved the way for the 12-Day War. But that's my brackets, if you like, in the middle of this question. You go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you've just said. The point, the Islamic Republic essentially claims to be an anti-Western nationalism. At the same time, and it's true of all of these guys, Erdogan wears a business suit, not Ottoman dress. The leaders of the Islamic Republic wear actually sort of Mao, but again, business suits and Mao type stuff, not Qajar period Islamic dress. Modi wears a business suit, not etc. And these people maintain large. They're sort of. What I'm trying to get at is that they ideologically present as cultural nationalists. Yeah. But again, taking the form of Islamism in relation to Iran's Islamic Republic. But Again, Iranian cooperation with the US starts with the deals which were made between the Islamic Republic and the Reagan campaign in the 1980 presidential election to keep the hostages in place until Reagan had defeated Carter, for which there were considerations offered, though what we know that they were offered, but we don't know exactly what the considerations were. Then we get the Iran-Contra affair, in which Israel, the United States, and Iran are in a network orchestrating the transfer of arms to the Nicaraguan Contras in violation of US congressional resolutions and of the US Constitution. And then more recently, Iran unambiguously collaborated with the United States in its operations in Afghanistan, and equally unambiguously collaborated with the United States in its operations in Iraq in the 2000 and between 2003. I'm not quite sure when that.
Probably 2002. Yeah, ended.
Yeah, from 2002 onwards. Yeah, but certainly after the invasion. So the idea that the Islamic Republic is an anti-imperialist regime is just delusional. That's not the same thing as it might not be targeted because the United States does do this. It targets people who are its old friends. Saddam Hussein was the United States. Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti was the United States' man in Baghdad. The United States backed the coup, which put him in power against the old Baathists, the earlier Baathists who were willing to play ball with the Soviet Union. And we can think of, actually, dear me, the Panama, Noriega. Noriega was the United States' man in Panama, who the United States went after. So second side of this is, okay, what about the principled approach of Marxists in relation to war between the United States and Iran? Now, I think it's important. There's a tendency among the far left to say that there must be one line for Marxists everywhere. In the United States and the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom is no doubt, no question about this, the United Kingdom is fully on side with the United States in these operations. The United States and the United Kingdom, our countries, are engaged in a war of aggression through the sanctions regime, and we have to be defeatist. We should favour the defeat. However unrealistic it is, we seek the defeat of this war of aggression. The same way when British and American troops went into Iraq in 2003, we headlined, the Weekly Worker headline, "Better the defeat of our troops than their victory." Though the realistic prospect was always pretty low. In Iran, again, the sort of far leftist thing is we should have a victory two line. I think that's problematic, basically, because you tie yourselves to a regime which is actually extraordinarily unlikely to win, so that you're tying yourself to a regime which is not only a repressive regime, an anti-working class regime, a regime which is unambiguously willing to play ball with imperialism, but also a regime which is actually very unlikely to win this war. And it's like, in that sense, Parvus in World War I argued for that the workers' movement should go full in behind the victory of Germany, because the victory of Germany would be historically progressive vis-a-vis the survival of the British Empire. And he wrote for the Turkish press why Turkey should join on the central power side of the Central Powers by joining on the side of the Central Powers, it would free itself from the imperialist control, British and French imperialist control. Ukraine should join on the side of Central Powers because thereby Ukraine would get free of Russian dominance. But the problem was this realistic? And the reality was that Parvis's line entailed betting the future of the workers' movement on German victory. And was it realistic? It wasn't realistic. In the same way, Leon Trotsky argued in the late 1930s that Trotskyists in China should fight on the front lines of the Kuomintang's army against the Japanese, should be in the Kuomintang's army. That was an unrealistic judgment because the nature of the Kuomintang regime was that it was like the Afghan puppet regime, as it was in the process of decay. It was falling apart. Everybody was stealing from it. Below the level of the KMT central government was just warlords of one sort and another. And the Chinese Communist Party, which preserved its military independence from the Kuomintang, but did fight the Japanese at the same time, we can see from the outcome, it was a more realistic strategic perspective. It's not a realistic strategic perspective for small groups of leftists in Iran today, because you haven't actually got a mass organized workers movement, which the Chinese had, though they'd been driven out into the countryside, and you haven't got a Soviet Union supplying you with arms and munitions and materiel generally. Nonetheless, effective defense against US imperialism needs to promote the idea of region-wide resistance to US imperialism in the same way as the Arab revolts of the 1930s led to the British temporarily giving up support for the Zionists in the late 1930s. Because you're imposing a cost. In that sense, region-wide action is, even if it's not at the end of the day victorious, is imposing a cost on the imperialist aggression, which is not imposed by purely national resistance. Secondly, actually, it needs to be politically universalist, as opposed to being we are nationalist in the way of we cling to bloody hell, another phone door. No.
Don't worry.
Universal. Okay. My second point was it needs to be politically universalist, because at the end of the day, nobody at present has the ability to knock down the United States armed forces in any way other than generalized nuclear exchange, which would lead to human extinction. But what is possible is that a politically universalist project, one which wasn't Iranian nationalism in the form of Shiism, or Indian nationalism in the form of Hindutva, or Russian nationalism in the form of Holy Russia and Putin, or we are the inheritors of Confucianism in the form of Xi. A politically universalist project could break up the United States armed forces and win people over to the extent of paralyzing the military operations of the United States. The problem is that the left as a whole has gone so far in the direction of the People's Front national roads that people are unable to see the actual need for a universalist political project. That's it.
On the last question, I will give a longer introduction, because I was reading Karat's Substack just before we started this talk, and it gives a good summary of what Jonbesh TV have also asked. just for anyone who might see this a lot later, this is being recorded on the 30th of January. I emphasize it because between now and when you see this, there could be all sorts of development. So Substack by Carrot has a paragraph which is quite interesting. It says between January 27th and 29th in 2026, something carefully orchestrated unfolded across Western capitals. Within a single 48-hour window, the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier group arrived in the Gulf. Donald Trump declared time is running out. The European Union unanimously designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization. German Chancellor announced Iran's days are numbered, and oil prices surged to a 6-month high. This was not a chaotic unfolding of a spontaneous crisis. This was methodical drumbeat of a prepared military campaign. And he goes on to compare it to Iraq and Libya. Now, does this coordinated effort signify another that, first of all, Europeans are fully aligned with US war strategy, and in addition to that, from a legal and political perspective, does labeling the official military force of a sovereign state as terrorist functions as a form of preemptive legitimation for imperialist aggression in the familiar and deceptive, under the familiar and deceptive banner of the war on terror. I would add here that the designation of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization has already affected the exchange rate in Iran because of the unprecedented draws that they have in the Iranian economy. And so we are seeing rates that would have been even unimaginable in December 2025. So I'll let you go.
Well, the short answer to that is yes and yes. Yes, the fact that the Europeans have acted in this way is plainly coordinated action with the United States, and that shows that the Europeans are fully on, whatever diplomatic talk in the past, the Europeans are fully on side. The Europeans, I did say this earlier, the Europeans have taken a series. What the hell is that?
Shall I stop it?
Sorry, something going on.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a horrible feeling that was the state, whatever, not the state, but you know, this emergency contact stuff going on or something like that. Anyhow, okay, this is it's clear that the European, I made this point in the past, the Europeans have lost whatever autonomy, partial autonomy they had from US global policy. And I went through, there's a series of steps through which that's happened. Second point, yes, this is it's exactly the same. It's interestingly exactly the same as the Austrian casus belli in August 1914. That the Austrians said Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by the Serbian Secret Intelligence Service, which was in fact true. It only became clear when stuff was dug up in the archives in the 1990s that Franz Ferdinand was indeed assassinated by the Serbian intelligence service with the complicity of the French government, possibly the British government, I don't know. That is less clear to me. But nonetheless, the Austrians then say the Serbian intelligence service is a terrorist organization. They don't say it is a terrorist organization because the language has changed. They say the Serbian intelligence service is sponsoring assassinations on Austrian soil, and therefore we demand complete surrender of Serbia to enable the Austrian forces to come in and root out the criminals in the central state government of Serbia. Mm-hmm. What was the response of the British and the French to that demand? Was to say, no, this is an unacceptable demand because it's inconsistent with the sovereignty of Serbia, which is, of course, true. It is inconsistent. And in exactly the same way, the characterization of the IRGC as a terrorist organization is inconsistent with recognizing Iran as a sovereign power. But having said that, various people have been making the point in connection with the Greenland affair that the United States government proposing to annex Greenland and talking about annexing Canada, this is not a change. This is change in practice only insofar as the US's immediate allies are targeted. Whereas the United States has consistently taken the view that, quote, third world countries have limited sovereignty. And this goes back a hell of a long way. It's a point which is made by China Mieville in his book about the origins of international law between equal rights, that no peace beyond the line. Now, the diplomacy and peace was always something which was the affair of the great powers. Okay, they did treat relations with the Ottoman Empire as governed by diplomacy and peace treaties and so on and so forth, or they did so from the roughly mid-1600s, treat the Ottoman Empire as if it was a great European power. Yeah. But they never regarded themselves as bound by any obligations of international law in relation to any extra-European state. And when they talked to these guys, when they made treaty agreement, things purported treaty agreements with Native American peoples, for example, they were carefully drafted in English not to be treaty agreements. Not to be binding. And indeed we have, oh God, not that many years ago, Ocean Island, the treaty, the League of Nations gave Britain a protectorate over Ocean Island, which had been used as a nesting place for birds to such an extent that the bulk of the island consisted of guano. And the British got rid of the inhabitants and mined all the guano. And having promised under the treaty with the League of Nations that they were going to restore the island to an inhabitable condition after they'd finished mining guano, phosphates, did nothing of the sort. And Mr. Justice McGarry, hearing the case in the High Court, said this is not a trust. The trust obligation which was imposed by the agreement with the League of Nations is not a trust so as to be enforceable, but merely a moral obligation in the higher sense. And therefore the British government can't be compelled. So just that sense that, excuse me, it's never been the case that the imperialist powers have regarded themselves as being bound by international law in relation to their dealings with places they regard as lesser breeds without the law. What's that? Kipling? I don't remember where that quote comes from.
Probably Kipling.
Yeah, it's Rudyard Kipling. My school used to sing that poem as a hymn in church, in Christian services.
Very good answers. Thank you. Is there more?
That's it. Thanks. Sorry, I said a
No,
little
that's
bit more
fine.
than I
Thank
intended
you very
to.
much. That was very, it's longer than I expected, but it's very good. It covers, we had a lot of questions to cover, so thank you very much on behalf of
We
myself.
just have to
and
hope that,
Jonbesh.
you know, it very much looks as though there's an immediate threat of attack, and we have to hope that it's not as disastrous as is likely to be the case.
Yeah, however, that's why I gave the warning of this is being recorded on the 30th of January, because we are living in dangerous times. So thanks a lot. I'll stop.